Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to this final session in this year's annual COMA UK conference. My name is Ashok Sinha. I'm an interloper. I don't represent anybody or anything within the shared mobility industry. I'm in fact the CEO of the London Cycling Campaign, and I also chair the London Sustainable Development Commission, which is an advisory body to the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. But we work very closely with COMA UK and with other sustainable transport organizations. So I'm very grateful that Richard has extended the opportunity for me to be with you today. And it's an honor to be able to chair this last session. Hope you've had a good conference. I was unable to join any of it yesterday, but I have been dipping in throughout today. And I was particularly impressed by some of the contributions from Scotland, for example. If you can make shared e-bikes work in wild and wet Scotland, and surely they can work anywhere. And the stuff on digital demand responsive transport, that really caught my eye, because we've had, a checkered history of the demand responsive transport in London. So I'd like to find out more about that. And it was very good to hear from operators in the previous session about some of the challenges they face in terms of the economics. But right now, for this last session, we're going to talk about government policy. Now, why are we going to talk about government policy? Well, it's worth recapitulating. As several people have already said, we face the existential twin threats of the climate and ecological emergency. We're all familiar with that. But let's just put some numbers on it. We have to, under the UK Climate Change Act, never mind 2050, we've got to deliver a 78% reduction in carbon emissions by 2035 under the sixth carbon budget. In London, we have to deliver exactly the same level of carbon reduction by 2030, because the Mayor, for all sorts of really sensible reasons based on the science, which we don't need to go into now, has brought that target forward to London to be net zero by 2030. We also have a whole range of other problems that we're facing in this society. We have the problems of air pollution, which is leading to thousands of people dying prematurely every year, and to people having life-changing pulmonary and other problems as a result of the air pollution. A sedentariness crisis, which is leading us to having some of the most unhealthy populations in Europe, with some of the highest obesity levels, congestion blighting our streets, and a car domination of our neighborhoods, which is preventing people from using this enormous amount of real estate that sits between our buildings and houses for purposes that are more human-centered, like allowing our children to be able to roam and develop their resilience and joy and love of the world, the capability of taking it on head on. So there are all sorts of reasons why we need to work together. And there are also to achieve some public policy goals that are centered on having a much more sustainable form of transportation system in our towns and cities. And government has clearly got a role to play. So in this session, we're going to ask the simple question: what do we want from government policy? And we're going to tease out the key strands of the answers that our wonderful and expert guests are going to give us. First up, so each of our guests, I'll introduce them in a second, is going to speak for 5 minutes and say 3 things, what they want from government policy. I might ask a few questions after they've all spoken. And then it's over to you, colleagues. From the floor, pop your question into the chat. I'll be scanning the questions. Colleagues from COMA UK will also be looking at them, and we'll pick out the juiciest ones, which I will read out to the panel to see what their sage words of wisdom are in response. Right, okay, so let's get moving. I'll introduce our guests now, all 4 of them, and then invite them to take the stage. First up, we've got Christina Calderata, who's Director of Transport Strategy and Policy at Transport for London. Then it will be Ali Clabban, Founder and Chairman of Lift Share and Mobility Ways. James Padden, Project Principal at Mark McDonald, and Arndt Betzner, who's Transit Strategist at Mobility Genossenschaft. Genossenschaft, here's a quiz question. You have till Arndt takes the floor to guess what that means. So over to you, Christina. 5 minutes, please. 3 things that you would like from government policy.
Brilliant. Thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So yes, 3 things I would like to see from government policy. I think the first thing that's really just crucially important, you've already alluded to it, I think, is that we really want to see a holistic and joined up approach. And that's what we're trying to do in London, what we try to do through this Mayor's transport strategy, but joining up public health policy, active travel, air quality, net zero, sustainability, equity, all of these things really need to kind of be pull together, and we really need long-term thinking on how we make that fit and how we kind of need to change the transport ecosystem so that we can see a mode shift away from cars, lower levels of car ownership, a shift to cleaner vehicles for the essential traffic that needs to still be there, and better infrastructure for sustainable forms of transport. So in London, we've just consulted on measures that are needed to tackle the triple challenges of toxic air pollution, the climate crisis, and traffic congestion. And what we've really tried to do there is kind of do what I've just been explaining, really, is really set out that longer term thinking, what we're going to need to do to meet these really ambitious policies, which, let's be clear, we have a very urgent need to address. So as part of that consultation, we consulted on expanding the ultra low emission zone London-wide in April 2023. But that's really a stepping stone to something where we need to move forward in kind of take a greater stride forward to something that's going to be more sophisticated, integrated form of road pricing, so that we're actually properly pricing for our road use. And that means having a single charge that could more fairly account for things like area, time of day, type of vehicle, road danger, availability of alternatives, really trying to kind of make sure that we're moving forward in a way that we are incentivizing and pricing all of our transport options in the right way to ensure that we are affecting the behaviour change that we all need to see. So I think that kind of long-term joined up thinking is something that's really crucial at all levels of government. Second, I thought I would do one specifically on shared mobility. So we need government regulation to create the right operating environment in cities. And that means that we need to be able to select operators, control fleet sizes, and specify how operational elements such as parking will work. I think that's really important if we're going to get to a point where we've got a really consistent level of service and a well understood customer offer and customer experience of people, that schemes can be tailored to local needs and circumstances. But again, it's all about really creating that pull factor, creating services that people want and need and work with the wider environment to try and achieve objectives across the piece. And then thirdly, and apologies if this one's a little bit too parochial, but I think we need government support for things like scrappage schemes. So we know that government have put forward funding to support other cities, I will just say other cities, clean air zones. And in London, we had a £61 million scrappage scheme for previous iterations of ULEZ. We've announced that there'll be another £110 million scrappage scheme for London-wide ULEZ expansion. But we published earlier this year an evaluation report of that first scrappage scheme. And what it's really proven is that these are really effective schemes in helping support those outcomes that we want to see. So from the car and motorcycle scrappage scheme, a third of people who received those payments did not buy a replacement vehicle, and 22% of them no longer had access to a car in their household afterwards. All of them reported we had increases in walking, cycling and public transport use, and decreases in car use. So as part of that scheme, and indeed in developing a new scheme, we've been working with third parties to make sure that that alternative package to car ownership is as attractive as it can be. And I think what the London scheme has shown is that there is an appetite for that, there is a demand for it. If you give people the right choices, then those alternatives are attractive to them and they are willing to take them up. And this is, literally putting money where your mouth is, giving people those scrappage payments and giving them the alternatives that say, actually, you'll get better value out of this and it could be a preferable alternative to car use. So I think with the next scrappage scheme, we'll be looking to bolster that even further. But I think when we're looking at London, what we want from government, the size and scale of the London scheme and the fact that we've kind of evaluated what came out of it has demonstrated the value of something like this. So London funding is kind of prioritised for Londoners, but you can see how with a national scrappage scheme, you could actually really start to see some quite significant outcomes if we could get that to happen at a larger scale. So I'll stop my piece there. That's my three.
Thank you so much, Christina. Now, colleagues, it seems that we're not going to have James Haddon after all. So that does allow me the opportunity to do something that I said I wasn't going to do, which is ask questions after each presentation. Christina, you're going to hate me for this, but I'm going to be this is a really cheeky question. net zero 2030, we need to achieve a 27% reduction in vehicle kilometers in London by then as part of that. What percentage of road journeys will be made, should be made by shared mobility come 2030? What do you reckon?
Okay, so yeah, you have asked an incredibly difficult question. So, and I think what's really important is that we have that 2030 net zero carbon ambition. It's really ambitious. There is not a clear pathway to us meeting that. There will be a pathway. We're doing that work now. We're trying to understand exactly what we'll need to do. The 27% that you referenced, that was work that Element Energy did, looking at how you could meet the 2030 ambition. And they looked at a number of different pathways, and the one that the Mayor identified as a preferred pathway had this 27% reduction in car vehicle kilometres. I think that's, again, it's really helpful to have that kind of marker. It doesn't necessarily mean that the pathway will have to be 27% and no more and no less. We will now start looking at how you can achieve that. So it's likely, I think, that we won't have fixed mode share targets for each mode. However, what's really clear is that even if you've got 27% as a kind of marker in the sand, that is so significant in the scale of reduction that's needed in London, that it's clear that we need to just think about the alternatives in a really kind of different way. The significant level of mode shift that you need to see means that we need to be thinking really kind of innovatively, differently, about how we invest in alternatives. But also, I think a really key point about this, and it goes back to the road user charging kind of point, is about how you get the road space to make sure that you have really attractive infrastructure for people so they feel safe and confident to walk and cycle because there are lower traffic levels and there's really good space for them. You also need that road space because you need buses to be faster and more attractive. So I think the kind of, it goes back to the ecosystem point. What we really need to do is reduce traffic. That frees up road space. Then we can look at what we need to fund in the meantime. Shared mobility is going to be a really, really important part of that. The shift away from car ownership is such an important link to break with that links to kind of high levels of car use that I can say clearly that it will need to be a very important part of the package. I can't give you a numerical value.
Totally understand that. Heroic answer. Thank you so much. But that last point, a really important part of the package. And over time, I think we will have to be a bit more definitional so that we can help orientate public policy in the right directions. Okay, thank you so much, Christina. We'll come back to road pricing, I'm sure, during the course of this conversation. Next up to the stage is Ali. I've already given you your job title and affiliation. If you want to say a bit more about yourself, please do. But otherwise, you have 5 minutes and your 3 key asks of government policy, please.
Brilliant. Thank you. And good afternoon, everybody. Can I just check if you can see my screen? Perfect. Well, it's great to be here. Really good to hear the previous speaker and hear about the challenge that London faces in cutting road vehicle kilometres by 27% by 2030. So I'm hoping I can segue nicely into that by looking at some areas of government policy that I think are super important. Before I focus on the 3, I just want to set some context here that policy makers need to think differently and be bold and courageous and honest about the level of change and challenge that we face. These numbers would be, that I'm showing here, would be different in London, but if you look at the UK as a whole, over 90% of emissions come from cars in passenger transport. So 90% of emissions, I think it's about 92% of emissions, and that has been increasing pretty much year on year since 2005. Only when the pandemic came along did it decline, but the level of decline that we saw during the pandemic is the sort of level of decline we need to see moving forward to stand at any hope of getting to net zero. So it is a vast level of change, but the worrying thing is that in 2022, the levels of traffic have pretty much returned to pre-pandemic levels, back up to 96% with cars. So we saw what was possible, we were heading back in the wrong direction. So the important thing with that, when you look at the cars and the emissions, although 2/3 of trips are under 5 miles, 83% of emissions come from journeys that are greater than 5 miles. So as much as active travel is super important, particularly in urban areas or pretty much everywhere, it is not going to dent the 83% of emissions that come from greater than 5-mile journeys. And neither, to a certain extent, will much of the public transport, because 64% of journeys have no public transport available to them. So unless you're going to roll out public transport in lots of areas which would be financially not viable, public transport won't touch that either. We need to look at how to make better use of the cars that are out there. And in particular, the area which is the most polluting, and the least efficient, which is commuting. So the first area of policy that Christina has talked about is we have to reduce vehicle miles traveled or car kilometers traveled, or however you want to measure it. Vehicle miles traveled is a term they use much in the States. And it is fantastic to see that Scotland have been bold and brave and put their 20% vehicle kilometers target out there. What's concerning is, other than in London, since 2005, energy levels and energy use levels and mileage has been increasing across the country. So we have to not only drop where we are, we have to reverse the increase. So we need to look at areas like in London, see what they've done. Congestion charging, road price charging, cutting back on parking, all those things can work, but it's very, we need to think place-based and not just think that everyone can do what London's done. The second area of policy, which I think is the biggest lever that is so unused at the moment, is increasing occupancy. It was fantastic to see the decarbonising transport plan include a discussion around we need to increase average vehicle occupancy by 2030, but there was no target in there. This needs a target, and my proposal would, this needs to be at least to increase occupancy by a minimum of 1% a year, ideally 2 or 3% a year. A 1% shift increase in occupancy is 2.5 billion car miles, or 750,000 tons of CO2. And just to put this in context, the decline in occupancy during the pandemic, which is about 4%, if traffic levels return to how they are at the occupancy levels they are at the moment, pre-pandemic, that would put as much CO2 back on the roads as the entire bus fleet. So it's like decarbonising the entire bus fleet will have the same impact as increasing occupancy by 4%. And that's just getting back to where we were 2 years ago. So we need to rapidly increase vehicle occupancy. And the final policy is around employers and the role they play in this. So I think it was a disaster that travel emissions were put in, most travel emissions were put in Scope 3 emissions, categorised under Scope 3. They should have been Scope 1 emissions. Businesses can control how their staff travel and the vehicles they use, and where they base their offices. And up until recently, very, very few employers have done anything to reduce emissions. And the work we've been doing with employers highlights that between 20 and 30% of many office-based businesses comes from commuting. 20 to 30% of office-based businesses comes from commuting, and many of them weren't recording it at all. Very few local authorities are recording it at all, and we need to change that. So just to set some hope, we've done a lot of work looking at commuters and their behaviours and what they want to do. We did a huge survey in March this year. That QR code, if you click on it, will take you straight to the results. But here's just one from a NHS survey we did. What this is showing is how people were travelling pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and now, and what modes they would consider and what they could be encouraged to do. So the purple shows what they could consider. And when you look at, in this case, a hospital, number of people who would consider traveling by bus, shifting to electric cars, car sharing, cycling, working from home is all a big increase. What's really, really exciting is to say, could you be encouraged to use these modes? And there you see over 50% of these staff could be encouraged to travel by bus, 60% could be encouraged to car share, nearly 30% could be encouraged to cycle. So it's then working out what would encourage those people. There's huge latent demand out there with the services that are already there. We need to and can shift these people across. And I think if we implement policies around the 3 areas I talked about earlier, then we will get there. And just to highlight that this isn't just me saying this from Mobility Ways and LiftShare. This was a YouGov survey from 2018 showing that when asked if people looked favourably or unfavourably upon different modes of travel, going in a car as a passenger came out second below walking, ahead of going by car as a driver. So this is showing that people are very receptive to being passengers, and all of our experience at LiftShare shows that if people try it, they love it. but we just need policies to encourage more and more people to share cars. Where this works in a workplace, so this is one of many examples, this is from Arup. They introduced a lift share scheme, and within 3 months had 50% of their staff sharing cars to work. Within 3 months, 50% of their staff sharing cars to work, resulting in 30% fewer cars on site and a 28% reduction in commuter emissions. TfL are looking for how to reduce commuting miles by 27%, 28%. Get every employer who's got car parking to introduce lift sharing schemes. So in summary, the 3 areas: we need to reduce car miles. There needs to be a very clear statement from central government that that's the direction of travel and we've got to get there. And for local authorities to take that on too. We need to increase car occupancy urgently. We need to measure it and increase it. And we need mandatory travel emissions reporting for all employers. And I would suggest with over 250 staff. Thank you.
Fantastic, Ali. Very, very clear and suitably ambitious and targeted. I'm going to ask you one follow-up question, if I may. I was curious about the suggestion for a target on occupancy. And I think you've already partly answered this. So imagine I'm TfL, Mayor of London, or London Borough. I now have a target to increase vehicle occupancy by 1% per annum. What tools, you mentioned one, workplace parking, removing it unless it's unless the vehicle is shared. What tools do authorities have at their disposals to deliver that kind of rate of change? Okay,
so the first thing they need to be doing is measuring it. TfL actually did measure it. I don't know if they measure it ongoing, but they definitely measured it when they introduced the congestion charge the first time around. And what was really interesting was that the car occupancy, the increase in car sharing, more people started sharing cars and shifted across to buses, but that wasn't reported at all. So things like congestion charging does definitely impact on car occupancy levels, as do fuel prices, as do clean air zones, as does parking restrictions. So the first thing to do is to record it. The second thing to do is to see whatever initiatives you're doing, what impact do they have on car occupancy levels? If you build new road space, you'll find car occupancy goes down. If you increase EVs, you might find car occupancy actually also goes down because the perceived cost of cars declines. So you need to think about those areas. There are lots of things, other things to do, but I'd just encourage every local authority to at least be measuring it and then to work out what they can do to increase it by a minimum of 1% a year. It could just be that fuel prices going up will increase it, but there are things that they can do. You could start having car share lanes, you could start doing it, but in general, where we've seen areas like Devon simply promote car sharing, they've got car occupancy levels going up.
All right, that was very clear. I think we'll probably road pricing again relates to the answer you just given. I'm sure we'll come back to it in due course. Thank you, Ali. So our final speaker, because we don't have James Padden here today, is Arndt Betzner. And Arndt, if you could introduce yourself as well as tell us what, for those who haven't guessed it yet, Genossenschaft means.
Well, thank you, Ashok, for the kind introduction. And Genossenschaft indeed means cooperative. So it's very simple. I've been for the past 11 years a director of the Swiss National Car Sharing Scheme that is fully integrated with public transportation. And I'd like to share a couple of perspective from that point of view, also knowing the global markets quite well by now, since I'm in charge for national and international mobility markets and the overall technical strategy. What I'd like to say first, and I think this is an extremely important panel and a very nice panel to conclude this amazing conference after 2 days with a lot of very smart things having been said. I personally observe, if you allow me to put that in a very condensed and maybe a little bit provocative way, that all big questions and all major questions in transportation and mobility are currently morphing themselves into policy and governance questions, and certainly away from technology. And I still observe that we have a broader debate and a broader discourse that is either centered on technology or, which is worse, if you allow me to say so, driven by technology. And the latter is particularly problematic since it can or cannot come out well, in the sense that technology is a tool that is ultimately to serve societal goals and not society to be a test bed beyond a certain extent, of course, for technology. I mean, Jan Gehl architects from Copenhagen, who've got a tremendous track record in and were among the first to realize what cities of the future could and should look like, have once coined the term, "Your cities are not the playground for our tech." And while that is also a very provocative statement in itself, there's more than a bit of truth in there. So this is something we should all be very attentive to. I myself, coming out of physics and railway engineering, I may say that today we've reached a stage of technology where technology is basically able to do, or will shortly be so, to do everything we ask from it. And the most important part is the latter part. We got to ask as a society, as the people also who are in this industry or in these adjacent industries, who are in this whole holistic field of shaping the mobility ecosystems of the future, to ask very specifically what technology needs to do to serve the broader goals. And that is something where we sort of have to little bit sometimes return the current logic. So let me be, after that, there's Christine and Ali have said it quite, I mean, basically I've said I guess the most important things. So let me be very brief here in adding 3.5 aspects. The first of the one is the most important. I think we need to, much more than we still do today, realize to what extent shared mobility is a spatial planning tool. So that means that all the policy that we can participate in setting needs to promote and needs to make understood to what extent shared mobility can make the use of space, of road space, of city space, of time also, which is also a form of space of our lives, easier and better in the future, and build it into a win-win-win system. And that is very, very closely related to the second one. It sounds a little bit trivial, but we need to keep this holistic thought about it. So governments needs to facilitate the advancement of shared mobility, not only in the city spaces, but also in the rural and suburban spaces, those things that we call the unloved child of urbanism, and where, if we want to be very honest, where a lot of the dependencies that are a little bit toxic that we have today, especially regarding car ownership, are originating from. I'll give you an example. I mean, many of the cars that we have in cities today, in major city centers, which we generally focus on when we talk about mobility, we talk about Berlin inside the S-Bahn ring, we talk about London in the core of London served by the tube, we talk about Paris intramuros, and this is nice. And we found over the past years, we found lots of exciting answers, and we ran lots of super interesting experiments in those cores. But what we didn't realize still to the full extent is that a lot of the problems that we see and we observe in those city cores are problems created from elsewhere, from outside. So it's the deficits of infrastructure and of offers outside there that create the problems in the cores. A very simple example, you know, the way that in large parts of the world, zoning and private housing is being designed is that basically new what in French we call zone pavillonnaire. So new residential housing zones and estates are being created where land is comparably cheap. You know, that may not be following TOD and may or may not be close to public transportation. But what we see there is generally that takes it away. This is where families move. This is where people move. And then what you have there is basically transit deserts, and you have a lot of trouble of getting these people, of not having these people with car-centered lifestyles. How should they do that? And the second big thing we need to understand there is not only the commuting, but the whole leisure mobility that, especially after the pandemic, becomes a whole field of its own that we need to understand much better than we do today. So those are the spatial planning tool and the holistic assessment comparing, including suburban and rural spaces would be my two forefronts. And two additional, the third and a half thing would be to focus on comfort, which ultimately means looking at details. What we learned in Switzerland, for example, from car sharing is that it makes a tremendous difference where those cars sit. You might have the density required, but if the cars that we rent out to people by the minute are not in the places where they are of easiest access and where they are very well visible, both as a product as to access them easily, then we drop, we lose a lot in usership. So basically, it makes a difference if you walk off a train platform and the car is right there, or you have to go through 3 corridors, then the stairs left, then through 2 doors, then an elevator 1 floor up, and then on the left-hand right back corner of the parking lot. That's not going to work. You know, a couple of people who are really into that will do that, but not the wider public. So comfort and ease of use are extremely important aspects and differentiators in terms of how we need to promote these whole things. And then finally, the 3.5 thing is we need to much better understand what works where. Not every tool, not every shared mobility tool works equally in the same space. It starts by, for example, electric scooters not working the same way in European cities as they do in US styles, grid cities, where we know that the average car trip is 0.8 miles. So there are things that are transferable, there are things that are not transferable, and we need to have a much better understanding and much clearer understanding also in the discourse we're having with major politics on what shared mobility can and cannot do with which tool in what site. That regards, for example, the difference between free-floating systems and station-based systems, where we know of the latter that their substitution rate of car ownership can
I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on.
Okay,
if
good.
you're able to
Good.
just bring your comments.
Good. Well, I'm coming to an answer here. So, sorry. So that's basically the points. No, I'm happy to discuss this. So that was it basically.
Thank you so much, Ivan. And sorry for being so terribly rude to cut you off from what was a very interesting presentation. Lots of very, very good detail. Can I just ask one question? You were very diplomatic in not saying what the UK government should do. What can we learn from what the Swiss government has done and what it hasn't done that you would like it to do?
Well, the major thing that we got here, and I mean, the Swiss government, the federal government, is less in charge than are the cantonal governments. And since Switzerland is a very democratic place where a lot of the local things happen on a local level. So I think we're looking at council level and others here at that point. But what is super important is to understand that, for example, infrastructure for shared mobility, like parking spaces on the public road, Jason, I mean, following what I just said, my last point, is extremely important for systems to be successful. And so are, for example, docks for shared scooters. And I mean, docks who charge them, and docks where you know where those scooters are, and not elderly people or people with difficulties in seeing falling over them at 2 in the morning. So there are learnings in this whole voyage that we've all been making together for the past 20 years. And these learnings need to be increasingly applied on the terrain. And that would be my point here. You know, it's not that we lack basic knowledge, it's that we lack the quick application of it to really drive people out of private cars and private car ownership, especially.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Art. Right, we're going to go into a Q&A session. While you're thinking about your questions, there are a couple of them in the chat. Please do, colleagues from the floor, put some questions to our panel in the chat. I'm just going to ask a couple, as is my chair's prerogative, before we move to that session of questions from the floor. So a general one, I'm going to ask the question on road pricing. I might say that at the next mayoral election in London, and possibly we can generalize this to the whole of England and the UK, the single most important transport policy that I'd like to see a firm political commitment behind is a universal Greater London single consolidated smart and fair road pricing scheme to bring down demand to match the supply side measures. Do you agree or do you disagree? Who wants to take it? Go ahead, Christina.
Yeah, I guess this is a pretty obvious one for me to pick up. And I think we have got to the point, I think, where we do have now a mayor who is saying that in order to meet targets that we need to meet to be net zero carbon by 2030, we will need to have that exactly what you described, a more sophisticated road user charging scheme in place in London. And so I think we've got to a place now where that is openly stated policy in London. Quite exactly what that scheme looks like is yet to be decided. And I think that's something that we mustn't lose sight of in this either, that I think that people like us can be agreed, and I think many people working in transport over many years have been agreed that kind of proper per mile road user charging is a really good and impactful policy. But it's much more difficult, I think, to recognise that when you're somebody who's going about your daily life and can't quite see why that's so critical, but it will make life a lot more difficult. And so I think what's really important for us and for politicians, I guess that's the kind of point we're getting to, is actually bringing the public along with us on this journey. And I don't think the way to do that is necessarily by talking about road user charging. Road user charging is not exciting to people. It's not something they can buy into. The point is what road user charging gives you, the cities that it enables you to shape, the quality of life it can improve, the environmental benefits it can deliver. And that's what we need to be selling. So the vision needs to be there. And that's what we're saying to people. This is what we want to deliver. The enabling mechanism for that is going to be a scheme, but we want your input on how we develop that scheme so that it works for you and delivers the city that people want to see. So yes, I think it's very important. Luckily, I think we've kind of made that step now where we do have open acknowledgement that it's really important. Now it's kind of a bit on us, the stakeholder community, us at TfL, to make sure that we turn that into something that is a really tangible, positive policy that people can get on board with.
Super, and I hope it's a policy that all candidates going to the next election in London and elsewhere will be able to support. Ali, do you want to make a contribution on that particular topic? Don't worry if you don't want to.
I think, I think I'd like to actually second that, and I think that it's blatantly important to realize that the age of one size fits all is over. So if we talk about, for example, congestion charges, and I see, I was happy enough to work in Singapore for quite some time, and if I see the Mark III and Mark IV congestion charge that Singapore has there, one of the next steps they could do and they are thinking about is actually implementing a differentiation between private vehicles, service vehicles, good vehicles, and, for example, shared mobility vehicles. So there needs to be some incentive, since car ownership is still in around most of the planet much too easy compared to the goals, the overarching goals that we are facing here. We need some differentiators, and we need to give shared mobility very tangible assets, also in terms of accessibility. And I don't mean things like accessing bus lanes for electric vehicles. That is rubbish in my ideas, these kind of things. It should never impact public transportation, which we all know is the backbone for every shared mobility system to function decently. So it was said before, I think Christina mentioned it, the public transit bus stays the epicenter of everything that we're talking about here. And making faster buses, faster trains, better connection, more reliable service. That stays the backbone of everything. That's the background on which shared mobility can and will thrive. But then again, we need to think, for example, if like a taxi that has certain privileges in road use, if we could also give that in the future in a very thoughtful way to shared vehicles.
Thank you. And actually, Ali, if you don't mind, if you forgive me, just in the interest of time, I'm going to ask one more question for everybody, and then we'll open the floor. Now, the Secretary of State yesterday said that the transport bill that we're all avidly awaiting is now not going to be progressed during the current Parliament. So we're going to have to wait until at least 2024. Now, given that a few things are resting on this, such as, and you mentioned it, Christine, but others during the course of the conference have mentioned it, regulatory changes that are needed to help us embrace micromobility and other technologies, they may not happen for a while. What do you feel about that? How do we move forward on the regulatory changes or the regulatory framework that we need if things like the transport bill are going to be kicked down the road? Is there another way to do it?
I think it's really difficult. It makes it much more difficult, doesn't it? I think without that framework in place, we're left to carry on kind of in a more ad hoc way. And I think what all of us are saying is that what this really needs is some sort of consistent approach and a coherent approach. And and all of us carry on slightly piecemeal kind of works against that. So I think the sooner that it's there, the easier it is for us all to kind of get on board and make progress together. In London, with the e-scooter trial, we've tried to really bring a consistent approach. So TfL managing it across all the boroughs, I think that helps. But really, we need to know what we're kind of moving to longer term.
All right, and that's fair. I mean, it's not there. It's not going to happen for a while. Perhaps we should all collectively start lobbying for a bespoke piece of work to be done by government on this specific issue, whatever happens to the transport bill more generally. They've already hived off the trains, after all, into a different piece of legislation. Okay, right, over to the floor. Put your questions into the chat, please. I'm going to pick up one that was made earlier. Very, very specific question. I think it probably goes to you, Christina. It says, can the scrappage scheme that we have in London be contingent on you giving up your car for at least 1 year, for example? And when you answer that, perhaps you should also tell people, because I don't think you mentioned it, that there are other parts of the scrappage scheme. There are other incentives in the scrappage scheme that are available to people who choose to avail themselves of it.
Yeah, sure. I can explain a bit more about scrappage. So I think on the specific question about whether you could make it contingent on giving your car up for a year, I think that's probably quite difficult because, so it was the car and motorcycle scrappage scheme in London, and this could work differently if you're doing something else, but in London it's focused on disabled Londoners and people from low incomes, and we did a lot of work with those stakeholder groups beforehand, knowing that they would be harder to reach and they'd find it harder to adapt. And we talked a lot about, so part of the reason that we didn't have mobility credits as a kind of all singing, all dancing thing in the first scheme was one of the things that came across really strongly was that actually if you're on a lower income, us giving you money and telling you how you need to spend it is kind of not understanding the challenges that people face. And when people are on low incomes, there are a lot of different kind of trade-offs and balancing acts that they need to do. And so being too prescriptive about that, I think if we were to say that they couldn't have a car for a year, that might actually increase the challenges and pressures on their life. So I'm not sure if having some kind of rule about not being able to own a car would be the right way to go. But I think that we've tried to do it rather than the push, we've tried to do it the pull, and that probably goes more onto some of the other elements of scrappage. So within the scrappage scheme, last time we did have these third-party deals where we worked with partners who offered kind of preferential rates or match funding or various different things, which provided people discounts on car alternatives, and we had free cycle hire membership for a year. So we had some alternatives to just buying a car. This time what we've tried to do is build in more of that mobility credit type approach. So this time round, if you are scrapping a car, you can either get a £2,000 payment, or you can opt for a £1,600 payment and one annual bus and tram ticket. That takes the overall value way up higher than £2,000. Or you can take a £1,200 payment and get 2 annual bus and tram tickets worth even more money. And that again that's maybe supporting you if you use your car and somebody else was reliant upon it. So now we're trying to say, okay, how can we provide support for 2 people in a household, which doesn't involve needing to have a car and do kind of lift sharing. So we've got that mobility credit option, and we've got the others. We've also, this time for vans, we've got a retrofit option, and we've got higher levels of payment if people are switching to electric vehicles as well. So we tried to build in more incentives for people either to not replace at all and actually give them higher value packages, or to provide a further financial incentive that if you do need to replace your car or your van and you are going to keep driving, that actually if you're going to replace it, we'll give you a bit of extra money if you can do an electric replacement. So we've tried to build in as many incentives we can with something that still needs to be kind of quite quick and easy for people to use and understand.
Thank you, Christina. May I actually add some congratulations? I don't think that was an easy piece of work, and you've done, you and TfL and the Mayor's Office have done a good job on navigating this, I think. I'm going to ask a question to Ali and to whoever wants to put this up. Richard has asked this enormously broad and multidimensional question, which is, what do the panelists think government policy should be on EVs? And I'll invite you to interpret that in any way you see fit.
I mean, I think the government have done a great job of pushing EVs over the last few years, but I think that the danger is that the assumption is that EVs are going to decarbonize cars as much as they need to. And that's simply not the case. They're not going to decarbonize cars or the life cycle of cars as much as they need to or as fast as they need to. At the moment, it's like 3% of cars are EVs. We're not even really touching the surface. So EVs definitely have a role to play moving forward, but we need to get real and start thinking that we can't just keep increasing the size of the UK fleet. We need to start decreasing the size of the UK fleet. And when you look at the number of cars actually used at any point in the day, I think at maximum it's like 16% of cars are used at any point during the day, and those cars typically have one person in them. So when you actually look at the system, take a systems approach and say, how many cars do we need on the road? Well, we only actually need about 8% of the total fleet we've got at the moment, if those cars are used as in shared cars and they shared occupancy too. So then you start saying, well, how can we make all those cars EVs? So within a few years, we'll have 8% of cars being EVs. So potentially within a few years, if there was a big bold policy to say we're going to cut the number of cars used and we're going to increase occupancy in those cars, we could have a fully EV fleet out there by 2030. So removing all tailpipe emissions from cars through shared access and shared use of those cars. So EVs do have a critical role to play, but the level of investment that's gone into supporting EVs should be targeted towards sharing cars. And we heard some great stats earlier from Scotland saying that now it's £60 per person is being spent on active travel. That's amazing. In England, it's £10. But we should be spending £10 per person on encouraging people to share cars and share use of cars and share car clubs, because each of those will have just as big an impact on emissions as active travel. So I think everything needs support. EVs have had support and will keep getting support moving forward, but the other areas will have a far bigger impact far quicker. We need to be focusing efforts on them too.
Very fair, very fair. Arndt, do you wish to add your contribution to that?
Well, very quickly, yes. And thanks, Ali. I'd like to basically second that. The point is, at that point, to be provocative, less decarbonization than getting rid of the cars and the car-centric lifestyle. If a car club car, as we know from, we calculate with 1 to 11 in a substitution, in terms of substitution numbers. Susan Shaheen has advanced numbers of up to 1 to 18 that a car sharing vehicle, and there are higher numbers from some systems in the world that have been proven in scientific research of a car club car substituting private cars. I think that's a much bigger lever. But then again, yes, of course, we need to decarbonize them, and yes, of course, we need EVs. That's particularly prone for station-based car sharing, where you can really, where the car or the cars get back in certain spaces that are designed to house them and have them. And for example, what we're doing in Switzerland is that by 2030, our whole fleet of over 3,000 vehicles nationwide, in towns and cities, big and small, will be 100% electric. And we've developed very innovative schemes for how to get that infrastructure fixed, because no car sharing operator or no car club in the world can finance that out of their revenue stream. So you need partnerships, you need models, which also on the other side then helps to endure your business and give it a medium to long-term perspective. This is again an infrastructural measure that is tremendously important. We've pioneered V2X schemes here and trial schemes where cars at peak time, where the grid would need them, can put energy back into the network. What I can say from all these efforts is that this whole thing needs a lot of reflection, and especially fleet operators, as what car clubs are, can have a tremendous impact on that and can steer that. And if you allow me a very provocative statement, at the moment, as much as we need this decarbonization effort, my own electric car, my electric car is from 1995. It's one of those Renaults that they built back in the days. So I'm not new to the sector, but I'm a little bit scared by the naive approach that sometimes we take to what battery technology can and cannot do. So it's not a universal savior that will turn the car as a transport mode unproblematic. It's still there, the car-centered lifestyle, the big box retail, the way cars are built in our lives, and we need to get beyond that.
Very interesting, very interesting. And in the interest of being provocative, one of my colleagues at work says, why don't we just ban car advertising? Well, that's another question. I guess he's been spending too much time looking at the tobacco industry. Let's move on. There's another question which I think is quite provocative as well, given that competition is what drives innovation. Mark Strong says, outside of London or even inside it, is there any justification for competition between different micro-mobility providers. So the suggestion has been made in London, for example, that we should have some sort of franchising scheme and reduce the number of providers to a small number, and so that there's a consistent service integrated with what Transport for London does. That's one idea. But what do you think about the question? Who wants to pick this one up? Is nobody willing to stand up for competition between providers in the public space?
Fell off on the outside London questions there when I should pipe down.
I said outside or even inside.
Even inside.
Even inside it.
Yeah.
I think
Go ahead, Alan.
I think generally competition is a really good thing. It drives progress. But then you compare our transport network to some of the networks in Europe where there's a single provider of services, whether it's buses or trains or that side, and the ability to drive forward change fast or have mass or have whatever solutions there are, it becomes much easier when there's a single operator. So I don't know enough about the micro mobility space to know the levels of uptake you need in an area, but for me as a user, I would much rather there be one system that works that I can access rather than needing to think I need various different apps that I'm going to jump on. So I mean, I would love there to be a great micro mobility solution for me outside my door. And if it's one and it works for me, then that would be fine. But yeah, I think it's risky to say there shouldn't be competition.
I think that's a very, very good and very crucial question. And we're coming out of this age where we believe that market forces would do everything, and they do. And I'm a very strong believer in markets and in both private and public actors competing in markets. But then the question is, and we're back with the governance subject, who sets the rules for those markets? And it's the role of governments, of governance and of policy making to set the barriers and to set the rules in those markets. And that is where the learning curve is so steep. And that is what we've not seen enough in the past, for example, in electric scooters or in bike share markets. And what I said before, we need to kind of quickly now iterate on the learnings of the past. What I mean by there is really to see if it's necessary to have 13 operators of shared scooters in a single place, or if 2 would do, or if there are places where none would do at all, and you have shared bikes instead. So these questions need to be asked, and they need to be asked openly. A mobility system, the way we need to design it, and we want to design it to get people out of cars and out of car dependency, if that is the overarching goal, where everything, from decarbonization to kind of an overall more economically and ecologically able mobility, if all those things that depend on it afterwards, if we want to do that, and if we declare that the overarching goal, then everything else has to follow that logic. And then, as Ali said, it might well be that a well-governed but well-supervised single operator may be the better solution than a pseudo competition. We saw this in mobile phone markets. That is the era of the 1990s from franchising mobile phone networks, at least the way it was done in Europe. Instead of having a national network that covers everything and dynamically assigning that network to different operators afterwards, we have got 4 or 5 parallel networks and antenna systems where all in the same places you've got reception, and in the same place you've got no reception. Germany, for example, being a best example, where on main train and even highways, you have simply no reception of none of the 4 or 5 operators that are operating there, because the system was flawed in the way it was designed. So again, this is absolutely crucial policy questions, and questions on how we design that competition if it is to be. And again, in Switzerland, we rather tend to favor also in the rail system that single operator approach. But I tell you, there's a lot of governance, and they are being very, very closely watched for what they do and what they don't do, and woe to them if something goes wrong. And this is good, all of us are in that space, and all of us, if one player fails, the whole system collapses. So that's the thinking we need to adopt here. And a functional monopoly might be the right thing if it's well governed.
Well, that last point is one I would very much echo, and I do remember some of the negative impacts of the way that we rolled out the mobile phone network in Europe. Here's another one that's really close to my heart. A piece of work that we're doing at the London Sustainable Development Commission is looking at what a whole society just transition, interpreted very broadly, for London would be to a net zero 2030, but also more generally to living within broader planetary boundaries. And this question is one of the ones that is most tricky to answer within that piece of work. So I'd be really interested to hear your answers for various reasons. And it's from Robin Tyne at Coma UK. How can we balance bringing people along with the need for radical change at both a local and government level, knowing that it is a little over 7 years to 2030? And that's a very London-specific comment, but even 2035, looking in terms of the UK's legally binding 78% reduction target, it's not that far away. How do we bring people along with the need, balance that with the need for radical change? Who wants to take that? Alan, and then Christina.
So I'm going to link this to the work we do with employers. And in our experience, if you ask the employees how they want to travel, where they travel, why they travel, and then you provide solutions that are as good or better than that they're doing before, they can change behaviors very quickly because they've been involved in that conversation. I think this sector, unlike the retail sector, has been very bad at asking the audience what it wants, and therefore is providing services without really knowing at an individual level what individuals want. I think, I mean, the census survey data from 2021 came out today for transport, and the actual full data set doesn't come out till halfway through next year. And even then it was done during the middle of the pandemic. So the insights from that are going to be completely useless. We should be asking our audience far more frequently travel surveys, whether at workplaces or across whole areas or counties or regions, to find out how they and where they and why they travel, and then provide solutions that meet those needs, whether it's around accessibility, whether it's around time, whether it's around place. We can do far better job of asking the audience, and then we would bring those people along with us.
Christina, thank you, Alan. Christina.
Yeah, I was going to go back to the kind of the road user charging conversation, the consultation we ran in the summer. So I think people do really agree with the big kind of global problems. They understand those. They understand that we need to do more to address them. They agree that we should do more to address them. What we see though is that level, and then there's a bit of a disconnect because there's less support for the policies needed to get there, even though people do want to get there. And I think when we ran the consultation during the summer, we had the ULEZ questions, and then we had a series of questions about the next generation of road user charging. And the first three questions were around that triple challenge. So how important is it, do you think, that we go further on air quality? How important is it, do you think, we go further on reducing carbon? How important is it when we had traffic and congestion and health? All three of those had majority of support. So they were strong. What came out more strongly in the next question about what would you like a scheme to achieve, those three things came out, but they were not the top three. So more reliable bus speeds, safer streets, reducing road danger, and improving health. And so people agreed with those headline challenges, but that wasn't the reason why they'd agree with the scheme. But they would like a scheme that would deliver them other things that also meet those challenges. So I think, again, it's about having those conversations about, you know, we have these challenges, we need to do something about them, but what would you like the solutions to deliver for you? And I think there are tangible things that people can feel the difference in their everyday life. So yeah, I'd like my bus journey to be better. I'd like to feel confident that my kids could cycle to school safely. That is a tangible outcome that they'd like to see from, for example, a road user charging scheme. That we can deliver in a scheme that will also tackle the triple challenges. But I think the big problems are so big and so important that it's hard not to keep talking about them. People get that, but I think we also need to understand what the other benefits that might be less kind of laudable in some ways, less kind of world changing, but might be more compelling on a day-to-day level. And I think we need to show that those things all work together, and it's not one instead of the other.
So is one of the answers, I think you're right in all of those aspects, Christina, but is one of the answers also not to run big, relatively straightforward, simple public consultations that get jumped on by activists and lobbyists such as myself and those from the other side of the argument, which do not give us a representative view of what people want and do not have the sophistication to engage with them about the problems that they face, teasing them out, and the outcomes that they seek and the potential solutions?
So I think the consultations are really important. They're really important, and we do hear from a wide range of people with opposing views, and it's important to understand where people are coming from, the impacts that they raise. I think what's really important, that it's not just about one consultation. What this is going to require actually is an ongoing dialogue, periods of non-statutory consultation where you're not just saying to people, tell us what you think about the scheme, are you in or are you out? That's not the conversation that you want to leap in at. You want to start by saying, what would you like it to deliver? Then you want to have ongoing engagement with communities, with stakeholders, to understand what they need from it. Perhaps some stages of informal consultation where you're actually saying, right, here's some of our first ideas, tell us what you think about those, that will help us come up with proposals. I think we need to move away from the fact that you have one big, and they're not referendums, but they get reported as if they are. But even when it's just being seen as a single consultation exercise, we need to stop seeing that as a kind of one-stop shop of these 10 weeks tell us what everybody in the world thinks about this one thing. It's not a single issue, it's broader than that, and it needs broader engagement and consultation.
Thank you, Christina. Over to you. If you could keep it brief, because we'll try and get a couple more questions in before the end of the session.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Just to add to that, we should also, as I mentioned before, include those people that are maybe not the core usership that we see today. People from rural areas, people from suburban areas, and people who are not part of this, if I may say, greenish, well-educated academic level that we see as a vast majority of the users of shared mobility today. We cannot afford in our Western democracies to uncouple large parts of the population from what we believe is progress. They need to be absolutely included from day one in how we design the system's future, also because they are largely dependent today on car ownership. So that is quite often overlooked, unfortunately.
Well, that's a very good point. And if I could just segue on that, one of the things I think that is under talked about is, for example, again, sorry, talking about London once more, 50% of Londoners don't have access to a car or own or have access to a car. In shifting towards shared mobility, not only can we reduce the number of cars that are in London and the amount of travel that is done by cars, but actually provide a car service to some people who don't have access to a car for occasions when they may need one. So there's an equity dimension here that goes the other way too. At any rate, let's move on to another question, which this one is, I really like this question because I'd really love to know the answer to it. It comes up again and again. It's from Dave H. Glasgow, I think, something like that. How can we get a single account for buying all our travel, as I've attempted to do personally in devious ways? I've realized, okay, you've admitted that. To access hire bikes, car clubs, buses, rail services, you know, a one-stop shop for your journey planning, ticketing, and I guess quotation for the different options that you might have for a journey. Who wants to pick that up? Hey, Christina, you guys run car-based systems. Why don't you try it?
Yeah, so obviously in London, there has been a lot of integration of ticketing already. So there are many modes where you can use an Oyster card, or now your contactless card, so you don't even need Oyster to interact with the system. So I think, I mean, we have gone quite a long way. It's still not the door-to-door. So if you're talking about things like using new services, micromobility, even cycle hire, that doesn't work in quite the same way. So I think that is definitely still something that we should be looking to move towards. But I think it's sort of come back to what this longer term goal should be. And actually, if we're going to have integrated road user charging, what you want to make sure you're doing is still making sure that that pricing platform makes sense across the piece and that they are sending the right behavioural messages. So in fact, the more that you could have one account that could be used for all of your travel, the better. And I think that kind of integration is something that we'll definitely be looking at in terms of how we move forward in future. For now, I think we're continuing to look at how we can keep improving on that contactless offer. But I think what we're seeing, which is relevant to the discussions today, is shared mobility, innovation. That's going to be a challenge. Those goalposts are going to keep moving, which is good, right? That's what we want to see, more better ideas. But it means it does make it quite hard to keep up with in terms of those systems. But yeah, I totally agree that providing that convenience to rival convenience or the perceived convenience of car use is really important.
Okay. And it's good to know that it'll come one day. It'll come.
Well, yeah,
Hopefully soon.
Continually improving.
Continually improving. Right. I'll put words in your mouth, but still, I can hope. And does anybody else want to make a contribution on that particular point?
Yeah, very quickly. I think London with the Oyster card or Hong Kong with Octopus are probably as far as you can get with the classical systems, including dematerializing them and using your private credit card with fare capping and everything. What we need to do in the back now very urgently is align the different commercial logics that are there. The logic of public transit, where you can do things like fare caps because those trains are there anyway, and the things where you've got directly linear costs that are adding to that. For example, if somebody uses a bike or car for a certain distance in a certain place. So englobing that and including that into mobility wallets, brilliant example of Portland, Oregon in the US, where it works brilliantly, even if I may say so in a US context, so that shows if it's cleverly designed, it can work very well. Vancouver, as under the leadership of TransLink, has things that are very, very, very similar to that. But we really need to align the commercial logics to be able to integrate it. The user doesn't care what happens in the background. The user sees the simplicity of their car and they say, we want something, we want that to match it. And then come all these other aspects like the safety of public space and something like that. We need to discuss it and understand better. And what was said before about car advertising was absolutely right in that case. Very often cars are promoted as a safe space inside a hostile space. If you look at the narrative that's really being deployed there, and that is extremely hostile to the whole idea of public space, public transport, bikeable, walkable spaces that we promote at the base, which is the background on which shared mobility will thrive.
I'm glad you came back on the advertising point. My colleague will be very, very pleased. Ali, do you wish to contribute, or should we move on to another question?
No, I mean, I think in answer to Dave's question, I'd say move country if you want that soon, because I think the way our transport is set up in this country, we're going to be a long time unless you have the control that TfL have in London to actually do that elsewhere. So I think it is a challenge. It's good that people are trying to have a go at it, but I think we'll be waiting a long time before we have a fully integrated ticketing system that's fit for purpose.
Okay, thank you. Right, I will invite the audience, if anybody has got a really pithy, challenging question, you will have the privilege of being the last person to ask a question, but get it into the chat as soon as you possibly can. I'm going to just ask, a couple of people have asked about the technical aspects of road user charging. Just to clear, if you can clear this up, anybody, quite quickly. Is the impediment primarily political? I'm going to paraphrase, forgive me if I haven't got the question right for those of you in the audience. Is the impediment primarily political, or is it primarily technological?
I think it's a bit of both. So I can see a little bit of head shaking. So I think that the technology is there. The technology exists. I think when you're looking at a complex city like London, the application of that technology in a city like London is probably still some ways away. So definitely there is technology that can, track your movement. If you get in a private hire vehicle now, that's you put in a start point and an end point, and it will do a route and it will do a price, and that depends on time of day. Those things exist. How it quite works when you're looking at how you ask people to interact with that. So does your vehicle do it for you? Do you have something within your vehicle? Do you use your mobile phone? What happens if you forget to turn it on? What happens if you forget to turn it off? What if you're in traffic behind the bus? Does your phone know that you're on a bus, or does it know that you're in the car? So there are the technology exists. The application of it somewhere quite complex like London is still, we're still working on that essentially. So the technology is not quite there yet in London for use in London. Equally, I think there is a journey to go on. Politically, I think politically is one way of putting it, but I think publicly is really another. And I think the reason things are difficult politically is because actually what we need to do is make sure that we've got public buy-in. And that's really important, not just to make it politically saleable, but because if we want these schemes to work because we think they create better places for people to live in, then the people who live there should think that too. And I think that's really the point that we need to get to. So it's really about making sure that we've got a really clear objective. What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to deliver? What can people expect from it? And then getting their support to deliver it. And then at the same time, making sure that the technology is working so that you're delivering a scheme that people want and want to interact with. There's no point having all the bells and whistles if what some people really want is something simple. equally, it can be simple to interact with and complex behind the scenes. But I think we really need to understand what people need, what the city needs, and then make sure that we have the technological solution that can help us get there, rather than be driven by the tech that exists now.
Well, that's very wise and very logical. If I may just push back slightly on the political challenge, wouldn't it be nice if all political leaders and parties agreed on this point? But they don't. So I think there is still a political dimension to this.
Yeah.
Ali, do you wish to come in on that question? Political, technological, or actually Christina's really nailed it?
I think there's something that comes before that, which is there a clear goal? And I keep coming back to the Scotland example of the 20% reduction. So that just seemed to come through very quickly, seemed to have pretty much political support, public support. It's there. Once you've got a goal like that, you can then choose how you hit it. So it could be that road user charging is a clear lever you can pull. It could be that you're going to sort out parking charges. It could be that there are a myriad of options you've got, but you need that clear goal first. And I think at the moment what we don't have is that. If we've got that goal, then road user charging becomes a really clear, probably the front runner in getting there, and it helps you to then shape. So we've got to get there. This is why we've got to get to that 20% reduction because of these emissions. These are the options. This is why road user charging stacks up. So I think it's before you can, it can't just be pitched as road user charging. It has to have a very clear outcome before you start having that public debate.
Yep. Very good point, Ali. I would say we do have that in London, yet the challenge still remains. Maybe just need to get better at marshalling that debate. Arndt, do you want to add to this?
Very quickly, yes, absolutely. And I would even formulate it in a bit of a stronger way. As I said before, the technology is largely there and it can be tweaked. What is not yet there will be there in a couple of years and can be brought there. But the point is, we need, despite all the narratives out there from Alaska to Australia, the primacy is still the focus of the private car, if we are honest, in all the planning, consciously or subconsciously. And we first need to move away from that. If not, we are constantly, as promoters of integrated alternative mobility system to take the lead, we are still always running after the bus. And we need to get in the driver's seat, and that needs to be the primacy of all planning and spatial development that we have out there, and everything else should be a consequence of that. So again, it's about major government shifts towards shared mobility and public transportation, this ecosystem to take the primacy on everything that's based on the private car. That needs to be second, after 100 years or so, but it needs to be second now, and it's urgent to do so. And every day that we're quicker with that is a day that is good for the planet and for our society.
Amen to that, Arndt, and thank you so much for that passionate contribution right at the end of what we have time for. So I think I need to wrap this session by thanking our contributors, Arndt Wetzner and Christina Calderata and Ali Clavan. Thank you so much for your insights and your opinions today. It's been a pleasure to be the chair of this session. I'm going to hand over or back to Richard, who I believe is going to close the conference. Richard, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the speakers in this great session and all the speakers right across the conference. So grateful to you all and to the audience for all your contributions. The chats have been super lively in every session, which has been fantastic to see. I hope you've all taken some inspiration from this. We've heard from governments, communities, operators, authorities, campaigners, consultants, climate change experts, and more across our 2 days here. And we've heard a lot of ambition, a lot of action, a lot of pitfalls, a lot of problems, blockages. Replays of these sessions will be up online. Look out for a separate email on that in what I think governments like to refer to as due course, but we won't take that long. We at Como UK will of course continue to push for the many public benefits of shared transport services and infrastructure across the UK at national, regional, local and community levels. It all needs to happen fuller and faster, but there are some real bright spots and there are some exciting developments in the pipeline too. So time to draw to a close, which I do by thanking the amazing tiny powerhouse team of my colleagues at Coma UK. I think lots of you in the audience and speakers will know firsthand, pulling together an event like this doesn't just take half an hour. So it's been a big heave. I'm so grateful for that. Do get in touch with us, perhaps starting with the drinks in Edinburgh or London this very night, and starting in about an hour and a half, so I better get my skates on. Thank you again all, and do get in touch, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, bye for now.